prayer, because really a prayer is words, right? And here and they're Tibetan words, and it's sung to a tune, but they actually words are expressions of thoughts, and that's the mind. And the mind is Buddha's expertise. I think there's no doubt about that. We might know that in our culture. I say around the world that we all love to talk about the Greeks. Well, here I am in Greece. You know, all the fancy words in English are all Greek, right? So we all go, because we're these, you know, Jews and Christians, we go back to the Greeks. We know very little about the Indians, but I'll talk about this. But meanwhile, Buddha came out of this. Anyway, we'll sing a little prayer that's expressing two thoughts. The first two lines are for anybody in the room who already identifies with being a Buddhist. It's reminding us of our reliance on his teachings and everything. And the second two lines are really could be for all of us, expressing, we'd say, sort of stating our purpose, or the Tibetans would say setting our motivation. So it just really means why we're here. So we're thinking together, we're here to listen, at least listen, and I'm going to be listening, believe me. I'm processing. Listening to Buddha's views, Buddha's way of seeing the world, essentially. His thoughts about how the world exists from his own experience. And so the implications of this. So for the Buddha, the implications of the mind are two things. We've got this marvelous potential to develop our mind. I mean, we'll discuss that. You know, from Buddha's view, it's extraordinary. And then on the basis of that developing our own potential, we then are, because we live in this world together, we're able to help others. So to listen for tools to do those things, that's the idea. It's the practical one. For tools to help us develop our own potential to help others. Thinking like that. Sangye charang soke chognam la jangchu badu dagni kyab suchi dagi chönyen gipe sonam ki drola penchir sangye dropa shog sangye charang soke chognam la jangchu badu dagni kyab suchi dagi chönyen gipe sonam ki drola penchir sangye dropa shog sangye charang soke Chognam la Jangcho badu dagni kyab suchi Dagi chönyen gipe sonam ki Drola penchir sangye dropa shog. So the key, you know, as I'm saying, the key to how to listen, and is the assumption about where the words are coming from, what you do with those words, you know. Like I said, you know, I would say, I'm not joking when I say that I think the mind is Buddha's expertise. But like I also say, that's not very known to us. You know, we don't know much about India. It was interesting, a couple of years ago I heard the Dalai Lama say something just very casual. He said it was these Indians, more than 3,000 years ago, who were the ones who began this incredible, amazing investigation into the nature of self. You know, so that kind of struck me. You know, I know because I'm a Buddhist that Buddha came out of this Indian tradition 2,500 years ago. But as I said, in our culture, we know, and our Jewish Christian culture, we don't know very much about India. So it really made me think, because this extraordinary tradition. I mean, I remember even recently hearing on BBC Radio, BBC World Service, that the anthropologists can find no evidence of any tools of aggression, for example, which says something huge about a group of people. So if we look back into these Indians, their job was the mind. What they did, they cultivated this technique that the world knows now as mindfulness meditation. And we have many interesting ideas about what it is, and there are many interesting ideas. But what it comes from is this extraordinary, skillful, psychological technique that enables a person to utterly subdue, in a most disciplined, clear way, the grosser, kind of more berserk levels of our mind. You know, all thoughts, all the feelings, all the emotions that we sort of think is just this kind of natural chaos, but have been able to go beyond all that level of cognition to a subtler level of cognition, a subtler level of our own mind. If we study this, if we train this technique, I mean, any of us now, if we wanted to do this, to accomplish the goal of this technique, it would take us several years, up in the mountains, you know, give up sex, drugs and rock and roll. You can't do it in daily life, to really achieve the result, which is, in other words, accessing a level of mind, a level of one's own cognition that we do not posit as existing in our materialist culture. And this is a really massive point, because as soon as we hear the word meditation, we kind of lose the plot and get all mystical. You see someone closing their eyes and looking kind of interesting, we have no idea what they're doing, because that's not how we think of psychology. And certainly when you hear about a technique that enables you to go beyond the conceptual and the sensory, that and the materialist model, because we posit the brain, immediately just says it must be something like a spirit or a soul, and then there's sort of cynicism about it. But Buddha doesn't use the word soul, he doesn't use the word spirit. He talks about the mind, or the word consciousness. These words are used synonymously. But his view of what the mind is, and necessarily its potential, you could say are so radically different that it's actually quite surprising to us, you know. So let's just, first, before we look into what Buddha says and what our potential is, because that potential exists in the mind, we better be clear, even intellectually, what he means by the mind. Because like I'm saying, it's radically different from how we think. And this is a part of the thing here is, you know, we say the word mind. Every one of us in this room wouldn't question our definition of it. We just assume, we have our own definition. And so then if we hear Buddha's view about what the mind can do, it sounds pretty cosmic. Therefore, it sounds like sounds like a belief system, because we don't seem to think we can prove it. So first of all, even before we talk about what the Buddha says the mind is, this person Buddha kind of get a sense of where he comes from, you know. I say that around the world, I go to different places, and we all humans have we seem to have the same questions. It's kind of interesting. But there's only one question I've ever had from one person. It was in Nelson in New Zealand. He was a scientist, and he said, who revealed the teachings to the Buddha? It was a really interesting question, because that's our assumption about spiritual teachings, I think. It's kind of revelation. I mean, I was brought up a Catholic, and there's no question, it's revelation. Because why? From whom? From a being called God, who necessarily who is above everybody else, who is the source of the universe, who is the source of me, who created the rules, so therefore who is to be obeyed, you know. And I'm not criticizing this view, but that's our typical view of religious teachings. So therefore necessarily something you can't prove, necessarily mystical, necessarily beyond ordinary people. Well, first point, that's not the Buddha's view. Buddha does not assert a creator. He has his own views about how the world came into being, how universes exist, and who we are and where we come from. And we're going to be discussing this, because this is the basis, this is the nuts and bolts of the Buddha's view about the universe. And the key point about the Buddha's view of the universe isn't just to get an interesting bunch of philosophical views in your head and then pass your philosophy exam. The point of all of this is to hear the experiential implications of it, you know. Which means we really then to really understand what you, as a Buddhist, what is Buddhist practice, you know. So then if Buddha's not a creator, if he doesn't assert a creator, therefore the Buddhist teachings aren't revelation. So you have to ask, well, where did the information come from? It seems sort of an evident question. You probably don't ask it, you know. Well, if you read a cookbook or any book of instructions, I think we know without question that the information is coming from the experience of the person who wrote it. Well, let's hope it does. Or at least even if it's intellectual, they're stating their system, you know. So it seems to me a cookbook is either directly coming from the person who wrote it, which means they've experienced these cakes and know how to make them, and so are telling you their experience. They may be being respectful, are telling you his mummy's experience. That's fine, it's perfectly reasonable. Or he's made it up, which is pretty shocking. I mean, you know, even with a cookbook, the rigour and discipline to make sure you have right information is really intense, just for a cookbook. But somehow when it comes to spiritual teachings, we think, oh, I'm allowed to think what I like, because we assume there's no rigour there. We assume that, you know, it's just whatever you feel. It's sort of mystical. No one can prove anything. I mean, you know, people go off and do a course, a spiritual course, get all excited and write a book about it. No one asks for their credentials. No one says, where does this information come from? Because we think, I'm allowed to think what I like. We assume that about spiritual teachings, which I think is a bit arrogant, a bit insane, meaning you're allowed to think. We think, I'm allowed to think what I like. Well, we are, yes, you're absolutely right. But the whole deal is, and this is a Buddha's point, whatever goes on in your mind is the basis of how you think and feel, is the basis of what you do in your life, is the actual basis of your happiness and your suffering. So for the Buddha, the mind is the point. Whatever goes on in our mind is the basis of happiness and suffering. Well, you know, if you play the piano or make a cake, whatever goes on in your mind has to inform the cake and the music coming out. It's sort of obvious, but when it comes to spiritual, we don't think this way. It's kind of fascinating. So then these teachings, where do they come from? Well, unless he's cheated and stolen someone else's ideas or made them up, and that's for us to find out, they've come from Buddha's experience, his own direct experience. We have to assume that. Don't believe it, you have to check it to make sure that cook is valid, to make sure the Buddha is valid. Just because he says it doesn't mean it's true. So it's that approach to the Buddha's teachings. There's the word belief, and belief is reasonable. It means having confidence in somebody. And you have your confidence in that cook if you've tasted their cakes and you've seen other people make their cakes, so they seem a reasonable person whom you can now pay your money to tell you how to cook. We would check, we would be rigorous in our checking even of a cook. And you can have confidence in that person, like belief. You're not really that good yet, you haven't made many cakes, so that's reasonable. Well, it's the same in your approach to the Buddha's teachings. But the approach